All right, we have kids beating nose and an emergency Taranov split.
You ever have one of those days where things don't go quite the way you expect them to go? Today was going to be one of those days for me. At this point, I thought I'd managed to pull off my little experiment. There was no comb built under the lid in spite of having a little gap that the bees were using as an entrance between a couple of the upper covers. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back in time a bit. I had discovered a small crack between two of the inner covers that the bees had turned into an entrance. I decided to see what the bees would do if I left that opening there. And that inspired me to just go and do a general neglect test to see how the bees would respond when regular maintenance to the hive isn't done. Now the weather cooperated in a most amazing way. We had 2 weeks of good weather for the bees, followed by a week of steady rain. They were bursting at the seams and wanted to swarm. Now today started out with more rain, so I decided to run an errand, and unfortunately by the time I got back you can see the clouds in the background had already cleared. I hopped on the mower to trim the grass that we haven't been able to knock down in well over a week because of the rain, and on the first pass next to the hive I noticed a lot of swarming activity, so I grabbed my boys and told them to start banging on metal stuff, and that's called tanging. It's an old trick that sometimes helps to slow a swarm or make a swarm that has already left return to the hive. By the time I got set up, a large number of bees that were flying around had started to gather on the outside of the hive. I thought it actually worked, and I'd pulled it off. So I quickly proceeded with my Taranov split. In a Taranov split, you take all the bees out of the hive, frame by frame, and you shake them onto a sheet with a ramp that leads up to the entrance, but it doesn't touch the entrance. You leave about a 4-inch gap. Any bees that have taken orientation flights will automatically fly right back to the hive. But bees that haven't taken an orientation flight walk up the ramp and just hang out underneath it, not willing to fly that 4 inches to the entrance. Interestingly, the queen stays with them. In my case, I put an easy nuke with some frames under the ramp so that they would just crawl right in it. It was a very cool but rarely used split and allows the bees to just split themselves. It's obviously more time consuming than a walk-away split, but for me it's also more fun and more educational. Since I was in such a hurry to get started and I was battling a swarm, I just grabbed a bunch of stuff and headed down there. I didn't have everything I needed. So I sent the kids to find things that I needed and bring them back to me. I had my kid light the smoker, which went out a couple of times, and they weren't able to find the feathers that I normally use for a bee brush, so I made do with a paintbrush instead. Now if you look closely, you'll see a lot of bees flying around the hive as I'm working, and that's the first sign that this Taranov split is not going to go as I expected. Dad, can you tell me what is happening? Now, if I would have thought about that question, I probably would have saved myself a lot of grief. See, I thought he was asking about the split and the process that I was doing, but standing 30 feet away, what he was asking about was those thousands of bees spinning around in the sky above me that he'd never seen anything like that before. And that should have been my first clue that this wasn't going the way I expected. As I moved along, I got another hint that things weren't going to go as I expected. Instead of neatly dividing into a set of bees that marched up a ramp and took up residence in the nuke, and another set that flew back to the hive, there was a third set of bees. These bees were in swarm mode, and they would cling to the outside of the hive and circle above me, preparing for a swarm. In effect, by shaking all the bees off of the frames, I was restarting that swarm that I had worked so hard to prevent.
Yeah, now is that anywhere near a 16th of the hive? Yeah, look up. Is that 16th of the farm of the hive?
And another clue I missed. My son kept asking me what fraction of the hive was flying up above me. I kept looking in the wrong direction. The bees were actually flying behind me, not in front of me. As I worked my way down through the top frames, which were filled with honey, into the brood area, there were plenty of swarm cells, and so the bees were indeed doing what they naturally do to reproduce, and they were swarming. And eventually I did figure it out. So I did shake bees onto the sheet here, and they walked up and did what they were supposed to do. The walkers did that. They made their way into this easy nuke and populated it. And then if we look underneath the hive here and watch out for the giant wasp coming up right there, get rid of him. There's just a little space, and the flyers that weren't swarming went into the entrance underneath the hive just like they were supposed to. But right over here in my neighbor's pine tree, that's where all the bees that were swarming, all the bees that my son was seeing, that's where they went. And I'll try to put a little arrow on the screen. I don't know how successful I'll be, and maybe you can see the swarm as I kind of walk by it. And they were swarming up there, so what I did was I went and got a stair rail, the railing you'd have on a staircase, and I put a bucket on the end of it, you can see there, and I would go up and poke at the cluster. Every time they'd form a swarm up there and get a cluster, I'd poke on it, they'd drop into the bucket, and I'd come over to this easy nuke and dump the bucket full of bees in there. And that seemed to work.
And finally here we are 2 days later, and you can see that this easy nuke has a bunch of bees on it, and they're flying around doing orientation flights and fanning and doing everything that a hive normally does that has a queen in it. So I'm pretty sure the queen is in that box, and I've dumped a lot of bees into there using this bucket over the last couple of days. So that's the first part of the results. Okay, now for this one, it's a little bit different because this was going to be the Taranov split, and what happened was I realized the queen wasn't in there. So basically I got a box full of walking bees, but no queen and no queen cells. So what I did is I took a frame that had some queen cells on it and I put it in here, and my Taranov split turned into a modified walkaway split. So the reason that none of these bees are flying, or very few of them, is because these are all walkers, and you compare that to the other easy nuke and there were a lot more flying bees. So those are my two easy nukes that are kind of split. And then I've got the hive. Now the hive has all the flyers that went back to it, so they have all kinds of flying bees, and they're busy doing what they're supposed to be doing and raising up those new queens inside. And so hopefully I'll have queens in there and queens in that other easy nuke. But there's one more part to this little summary. And then here's the last part to the summary. Even though I've taken the swarm out of the tree, I've popped that bucket up there and dumped them into the bucket several times, there's still a small cluster that keeps showing up there. So what I'm going to do tonight is once they're all done flying for the day, I'll pop them into the bucket, dump them into the easy nuke with the easy nuke closed, and I'll leave them in there, trapped in there for a few hours until they stop being so darn stubborn and coming back to this tree. And then I think I'll take them and move them out to the high school hive tomorrow.